The blinding sun of Arizona Territory, 1877, cast long shadows across the dusty landscape as Delilah Morgan bent over the wooden trough, her copper-colored hair cascading in wet strands around her face. The ranch had been her salvation and her prison for the past 3 months. Ever since her uncle's passing had left her with nowhere else to turn but this remote outpost where he'd spent his final years. Delilah scrubbed her scalp vigorously, desperate to remove the grit and dust that seemed woven into every strand. Water splashed over the edges of the crude trough, dampening the parched earth beneath her feet. This weekly ritual was her only luxury, performed in the relative privacy afforded by the early evening hours when most of the ranch hands were occupied elsewhere. A twig snapped behind her. Delilah whirled around, water droplets flying from her hair, hands instinctively crossing over her chest, though she remained fully clothed in her simple work dress. The tall figure of a man stood silhouetted against the setting sun. Not just any man, Flynn Callahan, the head rancher who'd reluctantly allowed her to stay on after Uncle Henry's funeral. His broad shoulders and the distinctive Stetson hat were unmistakable even in the fading light. "Mr. Callahan," she gasped, straightening up and reaching for her towel. "I thought everyone was at supper." Flynn took a step forward, and she could now see his weathered face, tanned from years under the relentless western sun. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, moved from her face to the crude wooden trough and back again. "You deserve a tub and a door that locks," he said, his voice low and gravelly from years of shouting over cattle and wind. Delilah blinked, unsure how to respond to such an unexpected statement. "I'm quite all right, Mr. Callahan. This serves its purpose. A woman shouldn't have to wash like this," he continued, shifting his weight from one boot to another, looking decidedly uncomfortable. "Out in the open, using the same trough where we water the horses." "I wait until everyone's gone," she replied defensively, "and I rinse it thoroughly before and after." Flynn nodded, his jaw tight. "That's not the point, Miss Morgan." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of the breeze through the cottonwood trees. "I've been meaning to speak with you," Flynn said finally, "about your situation here." Delilah's heart sank. This was it, he was finally going to ask her to leave. She'd been expecting it for weeks. The other ranch hands had made it clear they considered her presence a disruption to their routine, despite her efforts to earn her keep by cooking, cleaning, and even helping with the accounts. "I understand," she said stiffly, wringing water from her hair. "I'll pack my things tonight." Flynn's brow furrowed. "Pack your? No, that's not what I meant at all." He took another step closer, and in the dying light, she could see the fatigue etched into his face. He couldn't be more than 35. But life on the frontier had carved lines around his eyes and mouth that spoke of hardship and responsibility. "I was thinking we might build you proper quarters. The old storage shed near the main house, it could be converted. Put in a real floor, windows, a proper door." He paused. "A bathtub?" Delilah stared at him, bewildered by this unexpected turn. "Why would you do that for me?" Flynn's gaze moved to the horizon, as if the answer lay somewhere in the purpling twilight. "Your uncle was a good man. He saved my life once. Did you know that? Back during the war." She shook her head. Uncle Henry had rarely spoken of his past. "Besides," Flynn continued, "winter's coming. Can't have you freezing in that drafty bunkhouse corner we've got you in. Bad for morale if the only woman on the place catches her death of cold." Delilah wasn't sure if he was making a joke. Flynn Callahan wasn't known for his humor. In the 3 months she'd been at the Broken Spur Ranch, she'd rarely seen him smile. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say you'll stay on," he replied, the words coming quickly. "The men may grumble, but truth is, the place runs better with you here." Meals are on time, accounts are in order. Even old Hank is complaining less about his rheumatism since you started making that willow bark tea. Delilah felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the day. It was the first acknowledgement that her presence might be valued. "I'll stay," she said softly. "And thank you for the offer of better quarters." Flynn nodded once, decisively. "Good. We'll start tomorrow." He turned to leave, then paused. "Finish your washing, Miss Morgan. I'll make sure no one else comes this way." As he walked back toward the main house, his tall figure disappearing into the growing darkness, Delilah stood motionless by the trough, her hair dripping onto her shoulders. For the first time since arriving at Broken Spur, she felt something besides grief and uncertainty. It was hope as fragile and unexpected as a desert flower after rain. The transformation of the old storage shed began at first light the next morning. Flynn roused two of his most skilled hands, Miguel, a talented carpenter from Sonora, and Darby, a former shipbuilder from Boston who'd followed the call of the West after the war. By midday, they had cleared out the ancient harnesses, broken tools, and miscellaneous debris that had accumulated over the years. Delilah watched from a distance as she hung laundry, not wanting to appear too eager or interested. But her eyes kept drifting to the activity, to the purposeful movements of the men, and especially to Flynn as he directed the work, occasionally rolling up his sleeves to assist with the heavier tasks. "Miss Morgan," Flynn called, catching her watching. "Perhaps you'd like to see the progress?" She approached hesitantly, conscious of the other men's gazes. Miguel tipped his hat politely while Darby offered a gruff nod. "We've cleared it out," Flynn explained, gesturing inside the shed. "Thought you might want to have some say in how it's arranged." The interior was larger than it had appeared from outside, perhaps 15 by 12 feet. Dusty sunlight streamed through gaps in the weathered boards, illuminating the potential of the space. "It's perfect," she said, already envisioning it. A bed against one wall, perhaps a small table and chair where she could write letters or read in the evenings, and somewhere a bathtub. "We'll need to reinforce the roof before the rains come," Flynn said, looking up at the beams, "and put in a proper floor. Miguel here suggests we add a window on the east side, give you the morning light." "And a stove," Darby added unexpectedly. "Small one, for heat." Delilah turned to the normally taciturn man in surprise. "That would be wonderful." Darby shrugged, embarrassed by his own suggestion. "Gets cold in these parts come winter." "I don't know how to thank you all," she said, emotion tightening her throat. "No need for thanks," Flynn replied. "Should have done this when you first arrived." Over the next 2 weeks, the storage shed slowly transformed. Miguel crafted a sturdy door with a lock, just as Flynn had promised. Wooden floorboards replaced the packed earth, and a small window was installed to capture the morning sun. Darby surprised everyone by revealing a talent for metalwork, fashioning hinges and latches from scraps found around the ranch. The most remarkable addition arrived on a wagon from Tucson, a copper bathtub that gleamed like a newly minted penny. Flynn had ridden into town and returned with not only the tub but also calico fabric for curtains, a small mirror, and a rocking chair that he claimed just happened to be available at the general store. Delilah was hanging the curtains when she heard a knock at her new door. She opened it to find Flynn standing there, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "May I come in?" he asked formally. She stepped aside, suddenly aware of how intimate it felt to have him in her private space. The small room was transformed, the bed neatly made with her faded quilt, the table adorned with wildflowers she'd gathered that morning, and the copper tub positioned discreetly behind a screen Miguel had constructed. "It's wonderful," Flynn said, looking around. "The men did good work." "They did," she agreed. "I never expected anything like this." Flynn ran his finger along the edge of the table, avoiding her eyes. "There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you, Miss Morgan." Her stomach tightened with apprehension. Despite his kindness, she still felt her position at Broken Spur was precarious. "I've been thinking about your situation here," he continued. "A young woman, alone on a ranch full of men. It's not ideal. Are you asking me to leave after all?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "No!" The force of his response startled them both. He cleared his throat. "No, that's not what I meant. I was thinking. There's a school opening in Dry Creek, the settlement about 10 miles east. They're looking for a teacher." Delilah blinked in surprise. "A teacher? But I've never—" "Your uncle mentioned you were educated back east. Said you had a way with books and figures." Flynn shifted his weight. "Thought you might prefer it to cooking for a bunch of dusty cowboys." She considered this unexpected opportunity. "I would still live here?" "If you wish," he said quickly. "The ride to Dry Creek isn't bad, and we could spare a horse. You'd have Sundays off, of course, and the school term only runs 8 months of the year." Delilah sat down on the edge of her new bed, overwhelmed by the possibilities suddenly opening before her. "Why are you doing all this for me, Mr. Callahan?" Flynn stared at the floor for a long moment before raising his eyes to meet hers. "Because your uncle saved more than just my life during the war. He saved my faith in humanity. When I was at my lowest, Henry Morgan showed me kindness I didn't deserve." He paused. "I owe him a debt I can never repay. But I can try to honor it by looking after his niece." The simple honesty of his words touched her deeply. "I would like to teach," she said finally. "I've always loved learning." Relief washed over Flynn's features. "Good. I'll ride to Dry Creek tomorrow and speak with the town council." As he turned to leave, Delilah called after him. "Mr. Callahan?" He paused at the door. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Flynn nodded once, settled his hat back on his head, and left. Through her new window, Delilah watched him stride across the yard, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. For the first time since arriving at Broken Spur, she felt not just hope, but possibility. The school in Dry Creek was a single-room building with rough-hewn benches and a battered teacher's desk at the front. The town council, consisting of the general store owner, a retired judge, and the local doctor, had been skeptical about Delilah's qualifications but desperate enough to give her a chance after their previous teacher had eloped with a traveling salesman. Her first day had been terrifying. 22 children ranging from 6 to 16 years old stared at her, with expressions varying from curiosity to outright hostility. By noon, she'd broken up 2 fights, confiscated a frog intended for the lunch pail of little Mary Winters, and discovered that half the older boys couldn't read beyond a primer level. But by the end of her first week, Delilah had established routines, assessed abilities, and learned every child's name. By the end of the month, she'd fallen in love with teaching. Flynn rode into town every Friday afternoon to escort her back to the ranch for the weekend. These rides became the highlight of her week, a chance to share her triumphs and challenges with someone who listened intently, offering occasional advice but mostly just providing steady support. As autumn progressed, their conversations deepened. Flynn spoke of his childhood in Pennsylvania, his time in the Union Army, and his journey west after the war. Delilah shared stories of her parents, both lost to typhoid when she was 16, and her subsequent years living with her mother's sister in Boston. "I never fit in there," she admitted one Friday as they rode side by side through golden cottonwoods. "Aunt Margaret was kind enough, but she made it clear that my presence complicated her social aspirations. When Uncle Henry wrote offering to take me in, I packed my bags that very night." "You're braver than most men I know," Flynn said. "Traveling across the country alone, facing an uncertain future." "Not brave," she corrected. "Desperate." "There's a difference." Flynn shook his head. Desperate folk often make poor choices. You made a bold one. As they approached the ranch, Delilah noticed unusual activity wagons in the yard. Horses she didn't recognize tied to the hitching post. What's happening? She asked. Flynn's expression darkened. Cattle buyers from Kansas City. They arrived yesterday. Is that good news? Could be, he replied cautiously. If they offer a fair price. We need this sale to make it through winter. The atmosphere at supper that night was tense. The three cattle buyers, slick-talking men in city clothes, dominated the conversation with tales of profits to be made and deals to be struck. Delilah observed how Flynn answered their questions politely but guardedly, never revealing too much about the ranch's financial situation. After the meal, she retreated to her quarters while the men continued their negotiations. Through her window, she could hear raised voices from the main house, though she couldn't make out the words. Later, she heard heavy footsteps on the porch and peered out to see Flynn pacing back and forth, his face tight with frustration. Concerned, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. Is everything all right, Mr. Callahan? Flynn stopped pacing, surprised by her appearance. Miss Morgan, you should be asleep. Difficult to sleep with all the commotion, she said gently. Is there trouble with the cattle buyers? He sighed heavily, removing his hat to run a hand through his dark hair. They're offering 30% less than the cattle are worth. Claiming the market's saturated. Is it? No, he said flatly. Had a letter just last week from a friend in Abilene. Prices are holding steady. Delilah stepped closer. Then why accept their offer? May not have a choice. We need the cash to pay the men. Buy supplies for winter. He looked away. Bank loan comes due in January. This was the first she'd heard of financial troubles at Broken Spur. Is there no other buyer you could contact? Not in time. Flynn replaced his hat, his jaw set in a determined line. Don't worry yourself about this, Miss Morgan. I'll handle it. I'm sure you will, she said, though concern lingered. Good night, Mr. Callahan. Flynn, he said suddenly. She paused at her door. Pardon. My name is Flynn. After all this time, I think you might call me by my given name, at least when it's just the two of us. Delilah smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with her shawl. Only if you'll call me Delilah. Delilah, he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. Good night, then, Delilah. Good night, Flynn. Later, lying in her bed, Delilah couldn't stop thinking about the ranch's financial problems. Flynn had done so much for her. There must be something she could do to help him. An idea began to form in her mind, a risky one, perhaps, but worth considering. The next morning, while Flynn was busy showing the cattle to the buyers, Delilah slipped into the ranch office. Uncle Henry had taught her bookkeeping during her first weeks at Broken Spur, and Flynn had allowed her to continue managing the accounts even after she began teaching. She knew where everything was kept, including the correspondence. She located the letter from Flynn's friend in Abilene, confirming his statement about cattle prices. Then she found the bank loan documents, her heart sinking as she realized how precarious the ranch's situation truly was. The loan had been taken out 3 years ago, during a devastating drought that had nearly wiped out the herd. Flynn had been making regular payments, but the final balloon payment due in January was substantial. As she replaced the papers, she noticed a letter she hadn't seen before, postmarked from Denver 2 weeks earlier. Her conscience troubled her, but concern for Flynn overcame her scruples. She unfolded the letter and read, Dear Mr. Callahan, following our previous correspondence, I am pleased to inform you that the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad remains interested in purchasing prime cattle for feeding our work crews. Our offering price of $38 per head stands, provided the cattle can be delivered to our stockyards in Trinidad by December 15th. Should this arrangement interest you, please telegraph your response at your earliest convenience. Respectfully, J.W. Henderson Purchasing Agent, DNRG Railroad. Delilah carefully refolded the letter, her mind racing. This offer was nearly 50% higher than what the Kansas City buyers were proposing. Why hadn't Flynn pursued it? The answer came to her as she studied a map on the wall. Trinidad, Colorado was over 300 miles northeast of Broken Spur. Driving a herd that distance would take weeks, require additional men, and pose significant risks. Indians, rustlers, harsh terrain, unpredictable weather. With winter approaching, such a journey would be dangerous. Yet the financial salvation of the ranch might depend on it. When Flynn returned from showing the cattle, his expression told her the negotiations hadn't improved. The Kansas City buyers were preparing to leave, their final offer still standing. "You're not considering the railroad offer," Delilah said without preamble when they were alone in the office. Flynn's head snapped up. "You've been going through my correspondence? I was looking for something else and came across it accidentally," she lied, unwilling to admit her deliberate snooping. "Why dismiss such a favorable price?" "Because getting the herd to Trinidad would cost nearly as much as the difference in price," he replied tersely. "And that's assuming everything goes perfectly, which it never does." "Have you calculated it precisely?" she challenged. "I could help with the figures." Flynn's expression softened slightly. "I appreciate your concern, Delilah, but this is my responsibility. The men who work this ranch depend on me to make sound decisions. And sometimes the soundest decision is to take a calculated risk," she countered. "Let me show you the numbers, at least." Reluctantly, Flynn agreed. Over the next hour, they worked together calculating costs, contingencies, and potential profits. When they finished, the conclusion was clear. Even accounting for extra hands and supplies, the railroad offer represented a significantly better opportunity. "It could work," Flynn admitted, staring at the figures. "But the timing is tight, and we'd need to leave within days to make it to Trinidad by December 15th. "What about the school?" Delilah asked, suddenly realizing the implications. "You'd have to take a leave of absence," Flynn said. "That is, if you were coming along." She looked at him in surprise. "You'd want me to come?" "Someone needs to keep the books," he said, not meeting her eyes. "And you've proven yourself capable around the ranch." The idea both thrilled and terrified her. A cattle drive through wild country, weeks on the trail with a dozen cowboys, it was hardly a suitable adventure for a schoolteacher. Yet the prospect of helping save Broken Spur, of being truly useful to Flynn, was impossible to resist. "I'll speak with the school board on Monday," she said decisively. "I'm sure they can find a temporary replacement." Flynn studied her face. "This won't be an easy journey, Delilah. There are dangers." "I'm aware," she replied calmly. "But as you once pointed out, I'm braver than most men you know." A slow smile spread across his face, one of those rare, genuine expressions that transformed his weathered features. "That you are," he agreed. "That you are." The Kansas City buyers departed empty-handed the next day, clearly stunned by Flynn's sudden change of heart. By nightfall, Flynn had sent a telegram to Denver accepting the railroad's offer and began preparations for the drive. Word spread quickly through the ranch, creating a buzz of excitement among the hands. A cattle drive meant extra pay, new scenery, and a chance for adventure. Delilah's announcement to the school board was met with considerably less enthusiasm. The retired judge was particularly vocal in his disapproval. "Most inappropriate for a young, unmarried woman," he declared, peering at her over his spectacles. "Absolutely out of the question." "With all due respect, Judge Hollister," Delilah replied evenly, "I'm not asking for permission to go. I'm informing you that I'll need a 6-week leave of absence. Mrs. Peterson has already agreed to substitute in my absence." The general store owner, a pragmatic man with 4 children in the school, intervened. Let's be practical. We need Miss Morgan for the spring term, and if this cattle drive helps keep broken spur solvent, it benefits the whole community. They're our biggest customer. In the end, the board grudgingly approved her leave, though not without dire warnings about her reputation and safety. Delilah thanked them politely and left before they could change their minds. Preparations for the drive consumed the next few days. Flynn selected 11 men from among the ranch hands, choosing those with the most experience and fewest family obligations. Supplies were purchased, horses were readied, and the cattle, nearly 800 head, were gathered in preparation for the long journey. Delilah's own preparations were simpler but no less important. She packed her sturdiest clothes, acquired a pair of men's trousers to wear under her skirts for riding, and studied maps of the territory they would cross. Flynn assigned her a gentle but sturdy bay mare named Penny, and Darby fashioned special saddlebags to carry the account books and writing materials she would need. The evening before their departure, Flynn knocked on her door. When she opened it, he stood there looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "I wanted to make sure you haven't reconsidered," he said. "There's still time to change your mind." Delilah shook her head firmly. "I'm going, Flynn. The preparations are made." He nodded, then held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "In that case, I have something for you." She unwrapped it to find a revolver, small but well-made, with a pearl handle. "I can't accept this," she said, startled. "You can and you will," Flynn replied, his tone brooking no argument. "Every person on this drive needs to be able to defend themselves and others. I'll teach you how to use it properly." Delilah carefully examined the weapon. She'd never fired a gun in her life and found the idea intimidating. Yet she understood the necessity. "Thank you," she said finally. "I hope I won't need to use it." "So do I," Flynn agreed. "But hoping isn't the same as preparing." She looked up at him, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what they were undertaking. "Are we crazy to attempt this, Flynn? With winter coming on, and so much at stake?" His blue eyes held hers steadily. "Probably, but sometimes crazy is all you've got left." In the soft lamplight of her quarters, with the weight of the revolver in her hands and the certainty of Flynn's presence before her, Delilah felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. Tomorrow they would set out on a journey that would change everything, for better or worse remained to be seen. The cattle drive began at dawn, with a pale sun rising over the eastern mountains as the herd moved out. Flynn rode at the front, flanked by his most experienced hands. Delilah rode in the chuck wagon with Cookie, an elderly cowboy whose real name no one seemed to remember. His weathered face creased into a perpetual frown, but his eyes were kind as he explained the rhythms and routines of the drive. "Trail boss, that's Flynn leads the way," Cookie said, jerking a thumb toward the front of the herd. "Point riders guide the herd. Swing riders keep 'em bunched. Flank riders watch the sides, and drag riders eat dust at the back." He cackled at his own joke. "Hard work all around, but drag's the worst assignment." Delilah tried to absorb all the new terminology. "And what's our role?" she asked, gripping the wagon seat as they bumped over uneven ground. "We get ahead of the herd each noon and evening, set up where there's water. Have food ready when the boys bring the cattle in." He glanced at her appraisingly. "Flynn says you'll help with the cooking and keep the books." "I'm a fair cook," she admitted, "though I've never cooked over a campfire." Cookie snorted. "Different from your fancy stove, that's certain. But you'll learn." Learn she did, through necessity and determination. The first few days were the hardest, as her body adjusted to the long hours, constant movement, and sleeping on the ground. Flynn had arranged a small tent for her privacy, but there was no escaping the dust, the noise of the cattle, or the bone-deep weariness that came with rising before dawn and working until well after sunset. Yet there was beauty too, breathtaking landscapes she'd never seen before, stars that seemed close enough to touch, and a camaraderie among the drovers that gradually extended to include her. The men were rough in manner but unfailingly respectful, particularly after she proved her willingness to work alongside them, cooking, mending, and even helping treat minor injuries with the knowledge she'd gained from medical books in her uncle's library. Flynn remained somewhat distant during these early days, consumed with the responsibilities of leading the drive. But she often caught him watching her, his expression unreadable, quickly looking away when their eyes met. On the fifth night, as they made camp near a tributary of the Cimarron River, Delilah finally had an opportunity to speak with him alone. The cattle were settled, the men had eaten their fill of cookies, beans, and biscuits, and most had already rolled into their blankets, exhausted from the day's labor. Flynn sat apart from the others, studying maps by lantern light. Delilah approached with 2 cups of coffee. "Mind some company?" she asked, offering him a cup. He looked up, surprise giving way to a small smile. "Appreciated," he said, taking the coffee and gesturing for her to sit on the fallen log beside him. "How are we progressing?" she asked, nodding toward the maps. "Better than expected," Flynn replied. "Weather's holding, cattle are moving well. If we maintain this pace, we might reach Trinidad with days to spare." "The men seem to think you're driving them too hard," Delilah observed. "I've heard some grumbling." Flynn shrugged. "Men always grumble. But they'll thank me when we reach Trinidad before the first major snowfall." He took a sip of coffee. "How are you holding up?" "Well enough," she said. "Cookie's been patient with my cooking attempts, and I've kept the accounts current." She hesitated. "But I feel I should be doing more." Flynn's gaze traveled over her face, noting the windburn on her cheeks, the calluses forming on her once smooth hands. "You're doing plenty. Most women wouldn't last a day out here." "I'm not most women," she said simply. "No," he agreed, his voice softening. "You're certainly not." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the campfire and the occasional lowing of cattle. The night was clear, with a waxing moon casting silver light across the landscape. "I haven't properly thanked you," Flynn said suddenly. "For what?" "For suggesting this drive. For coming along. For—" he gestured vaguely. "Everything you've done for Broken Spur since you arrived." Delilah felt warmth rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the coffee. "You gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go," she reminded him. "I'm just returning the favor." Flynn's eyes held hers, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of how their lives had become intertwined through circumstance and choice. The moment was broken by a shout from the cattle pens. One of the night guards was calling for assistance. Flynn was on his feet instantly, coffee forgotten. "Stay here," he ordered, already striding toward the commotion. But Delilah had not survived this long on the frontier by being obedient. She followed at a distance, arriving in time to see several drovers rushing to reinforce a section of the makeshift corral where cattle were pressing against the ropes and stakes that served as a temporary fence. "They're spooked by something," one of the men called to Flynn. "Getting restless." Flynn scanned the darkness beyond the herd. "Get more men up," he commanded. "Double the night watch, and bring the horses closer to camp." Delilah caught his arm as he turned. "What is it?" His expression was grim. Could be nothing, a mountain lion or wolves making the cattle nervous. Or someone's out there who shouldn't be. He guided her firmly back toward the camp. "Stay close to the fire tonight, and keep that revolver handy." The night passed without incident, but the tension lingered. The men rode closer together the next day, and Flynn posted lookouts on the higher ground whenever possible. Delilah noticed how his hand often strayed to the rifle in his saddle holster, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. On the 8th day, They encountered their first real challenge, a river swollen by recent rains upstream. What should have been a manageable crossing had become a dangerous torrent. Flynn called a halt a quarter-mile from the water's edge. "We'll make camp here," he announced. "Wait for the river to drop." "Could be days," Darby pointed out. "Weather's clear now, but there's more rain coming. I can feel it in my bones." Flynn nodded grimly. "I know, but we can't risk losing cattle or men in that current." The delay was frustrating but necessary. They used the time to rest the horses, mend equipment, and allow the cattle to graze and regain strength. Delilah caught up on the accounts and helped Cookie reorganize their supplies. On the third day by the river, she was washing cooking utensils at a small tributary when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw Flynn riding toward her, his expression uncharacteristically animated. "I found a better crossing," he announced without preamble. "About 3 miles upstream. Local Ute showed me, apparently they use it regularly." Delilah stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's wonderful news. When do we move?" "First light tomorrow. The men are already preparing." He dismounted, leading his horse to drink from the clear water. "The Ute said there's a trading post about 2 days' ride from the crossing. We can replenish our supplies there." Delilah studied his profile as he knelt by the water. Something had changed in him during these days on the trail, or perhaps it was her perception that had shifted. The stern, reserved rancher had given way to a more dynamic leader, decisive and resourceful. The men respected him, not out of fear but genuine admiration. And she was beginning to recognize that her own feelings had deepened into something more complicated than gratitude or friendship. "What is it?" Flynn asked, catching her thoughtful gaze. Delilah shook her head, embarrassed to be caught staring. "Just thinking about how far we've come, and how far we still have to go," he reminded her, but his eyes held a warmth that made her breath catch. The river crossing the next day was a masterpiece of organization. Flynn divided the herd into smaller groups, with the strongest cattle going first to break the current. The chuck wagon and supplies were ferried across on a makeshift raft constructed by Miguel and Darby. By mid-afternoon, they were moving again, with minimal losses. Just 3 cattle swept downstream despite their precautions. That night, as they made camp on the far side of the river, a celebratory mood prevailed. Cookie prepared a special supper using the last of their fresh provisions, and one of the drovers produced a harmonica. Music and stories flowed freely around the campfire. Delilah sat slightly apart, enjoying the men's camaraderie but feeling the inevitable separation that came with being the only woman among them. Flynn noticed her solitude and came to sit beside her, offering a tin cup filled with something stronger than coffee. "Just a little whiskey," he explained. "Medicinal purposes." She accepted the cup with a smile. "And what ailment am I treating, exactly?" "River chill," he replied seriously. "Very dangerous condition. Requires immediate attention." Delilah laughed and took a cautious sip, gasping slightly at the burn. "Effective medicine," she managed. Flynn watched her with amusement. "First time. Uncle Henry allowed me a small glass at Christmas," she admitted. "But nothing quite this. Medicinal." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the harmonica's mournful tune drifting across the camp. The night was cool but not cold, with a canopy of stars overhead so brilliant it seemed impossible they were the same stars visible from Boston. "I never thought I'd be here," Delilah said softly. "Having second thoughts?" Flynn asked, his voice equally quiet. She shook her head. "No, I meant, I never imagined this life. When my parents died, I thought my future was set. I'd live with Aunt Margaret, eventually marry some suitable Boston gentleman, and lead a predictable, proper existence." She took another small sip of whiskey. "Instead, I'm on a cattle drive in the middle of nowhere, wearing trousers under my skirt, and drinking whiskey under the stars. Disappointed. Grateful, she corrected. Life is fuller here. More real, somehow. Flynn's eyes reflected the firelight as he studied her face. You've changed since you arrived at Broken Spur. For the better, I hope. Definitely for the better, he assured her. You were like a frightened fawn at first, all big eyes and ready to bolt. Now I'm what? She prompted when he trailed off. He seemed to search for the right words. Now you belong, he said finally. To the land. To the life. The simple statement affected her more deeply than elaborate praise would have. To belong somewhere, to someone, wasn't that what she'd been seeking since her parents' death? Thank you for saying that, she whispered. Flynn's hand moved as if to cover hers, then withdrew. He stood abruptly. It's late. You should rest. Tomorrow will be another long day. Before she could respond, he had walked away, leaving her with the lingering warmth of the whiskey and the puzzling sense that something important had almost happened between them. The trading post proved to be a ramshackle collection of buildings nestled in a small valley. Despite its remote location, it was surprisingly well stocked, catering to travelers, trappers, and the occasional military patrol. The proprietor, a grizzled former mountain man named Josiah Beck, welcomed the cattle drive with enthusiasm. Paying customers were scarce in these parts. While Flynn negotiated for supplies, Delilah discovered a small shelf of books behind the counter. Beck noticed her interest. My wife's collection, he explained. She passed on 2 winters back. Typhoid. I'm sorry, Delilah said sincerely. My parents died of typhoid as well. Beck nodded in acknowledgement of their shared loss. Martha loved her books. Brought 'em all the way from St. Louis when we came out here in '58. Used to read to me in the evenings. His weathered face softened at the memory. Don't have much use for him now. Can't read more than my name and numbers. Delilah gently touched the spine of a volume of Tennyson's poems. These must be precious to you. Been thinking of selling 'em, Beck admitted. No point collecting dust here. An idea formed in Delilah's mind. The school in Dry Creek has very few books. The children would benefit greatly from these. Beck considered this. Rather they go where they'd be used, he agreed. How much can your school afford? They negotiated a fair price, and Delilah arranged for the books to be held until someone from Broken Spur could retrieve them on a future supply run. As she completed the transaction, she noticed Flynn watching her from across the room, a curious expression on his face. That evening, as they prepared to leave the trading post, Flynn approached her with a small package. What's this? She asked, surprised. Open it, he suggested. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a good fountain pen. I noticed you eyeing the books, Flynn explained. Thought you might like to do some writing of your own. The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. Flynn, this is. Thank you. Every great adventure should be recorded, he said with a hint of a smile. And this certainly qualifies. As they rejoined the drive, Delilah began using the journal each evening, recording not just the practical details of their journey but her observations and feelings. She wrote about the changing landscape as they moved northward, the camaraderie that had developed among the drovers, and, increasingly, her confused emotions regarding Flynn Callahan. The days fell into a rhythm, breaking camp at dawn, driving the cattle until midday, a brief rest during the hottest hours, then pushing on until dusk. The terrain grew more challenging as they approached the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, but the cattle had grown accustomed to the routine, and the drovers worked with practiced efficiency. They were making good time, perhaps too good. One evening, as Delilah reviewed the maps with Flynn, she realized they were nearly a week ahead of schedule. At this rate, we'll reach Trinidad well before December 15th, she noted. Flynn nodded. Weather's been kind. No major problems with the herd. Is that good? She asked, sensing his reservation. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Normally, yes, but I've been thinking about what happens when we reach Trinidad. We deliver the cattle, collect payment, and head home, Delilah said, stating the obvious. And you return to teaching, Flynn added, not meeting her eyes. Everything goes back to how it was. Delilah considered this. The prospect of returning to her classroom in Dry Creek, which had seemed so appealing just weeks ago, now felt strangely confining. The cattle drive had awakened something in her, a taste for adventure, perhaps, or simply the recognition that she was capable of more than she'd realized. Does it have to? She asked quietly. Flynn looked up sharply. What do you mean? Before she could explain, shouts erupted from the direction of the cattle pens. Flynn was on his feet instantly, Delilah close behind him. They arrived to find the herd in agitation, several steers having broken through the temporary corral. Drovers were scrambling to round them up in the gathering darkness. What happened? Flynn demanded of the night guard. Shots fired, the man replied tersely. From the ridge to the north. Deliberate attempt to spook the herd. Flynn's expression hardened. Get every man armed and mounted. Delilah, stay in camp with Cookie and Miguel. But I can help, she began. No! The force of his response startled her. Flynn's voice softened slightly. Please, I need to know you're safe. Before she could argue further, he was gone, gathering men and issuing orders. Within minutes, 6 riders had disappeared into the darkness, leaving the remaining drovers to secure the scattered cattle. The night stretched endlessly. Delilah paced the camp, revolver at her side, straining to hear anything beyond the occasional lowing of cattle and the whispered conversations of the men left behind. Cookie tried to distract her with coffee and reassurances that Flynn knows what he's doing. But her anxiety only grew as the hours passed. It was nearly dawn when they heard riders approaching. Delilah rushed forward as Flynn dismounted, his face grim and splattered with blood. Are you hurt? She demanded, reaching for him. He shook his head. Not my blood. The other riders looked equally battered but largely uninjured. They dispersed to their bedrolls without explanation, clearly exhausted. What happened? Delilah asked, following Flynn to the fire where Cookie silently handed him a cup of coffee. Rustlers, Flynn said after a long swallow. 4 of them. Thought they'd scatter the herd and pick off stragglers. Did you? She couldn't finish the question. 2 dead, 2 ran off, he replied flatly. We recovered the cattle they'd managed to separate. Delilah had never seen him like this, face closed off, eyes cold. This was the hardened frontiersman, not the man who had given her a journal to record her adventures. I'm sorry, she said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was apologizing for. Flynn's expression softened slightly. Get some rest, Delilah. We move out in 2 hours. The mood of the drive changed after the rustler incident. The men were warier, the pace more grueling. Flynn pushed them harder, extending the days and shortening the breaks. He spoke little, even to Delilah, consumed by the determination to reach Trinidad as quickly as possible. 3 days later, they encountered another obstacle, a narrow pass through the foothills where the trail was barely wide enough for the cattle to move through single file. As they approached, Flynn called a halt to scout ahead. I don't like it, he told Darby and Miguel, who had become his unofficial lieutenants. Perfect spot for an ambush. Could go around, Miguel suggested, but would add 2, maybe 3 days. Flynn shook his head. We don't have the time. We'll go through, but carefully. They devised a plan. Half the drovers would go ahead with Flynn to secure the other side of the pass. The remaining men would follow with the herd at a safe distance. The chuck wagon with Delilah and Cookie would come last. As Delilah watched Flynn and his men ride toward the pass, a sense of foreboding settled over her. She tried to dismiss it as nerves after the rustler incident, but the feeling persisted. When it was finally time for the wagon to move through, her hands were clenched so tightly on the seat that her knuckles had turned white. The pass was eerily quiet, the high rock walls blocking the wind and muffling the sounds of the cattle ahead. Cookie drove slowly, eyes constantly scanning the ridges above them. "Don't look right," he muttered. "Too quiet." Delilah followed his gaze upward and caught a flash of movement, a figure on the ridge. Then another. "Cookie," she whispered urgently. "We're not alone." The old cook had already seen. Without a word, he handed her the reins and reached for the shotgun kept under the seat. "Keep driving," he instructed. "Steady pace, no matter what happens." Her heart pounding, Delilah took the reins. The mules sensed her tension and balked momentarily before responding to her firm command. They continued forward, the wagon wheels crunching on loose stones, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. The first shot came without warning, a sharp crack that echoed off the rock walls. The mules reared in panic, and Delilah struggled to control them. Cookie fired back. The shotguns roared deafening in the narrow pass. "Go!" he shouted. "Get through!" Delilah slapped the reins, urging the mules forward as more shots rang out. A bullet splintered the seat beside her. Another shattered a water barrel at the back of the wagon. She kept her head down and her focus on the end of the pass, which seemed impossibly far away. Cookie fired again, then slumped against her with a grunt of pain. Delilah risked a glance and saw blood spreading across his shirt. "Cookie!" she cried. "Keep driving," he managed through gritted teeth. The next minutes were a blur of terror and determination. Shots continued to rain down, but the attackers' position on the ridge made accurate fire difficult. The mules, driven by fear, pulled the wagon at a dangerous speed over the rough terrain. Delilah clung to the reins, one arm supporting Cookie, who was now barely conscious. Finally, they burst out of the pass into a small valley where the rest of the drive had assembled. Flynn and several men rode toward them at a gallop, guns drawn. "Ambush!" Delilah shouted as they approached. "Cookie's hit." Flynn reached the wagon first, taking in the situation with a single glance. He helped lift Cookie down while shouting orders to the other men. Some rode back toward the pass, while others circled the wagon protectively. Delilah's hands were shaking as she climbed down from the seat. Now that the immediate danger had passed, reaction set in. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if Flynn hadn't caught her arm. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes frantically searching her for injuries. She shook her head. "No, but Cookie," Miguel's tending to him. Bullet caught him in the shoulder, painful but not fatal. Relief washed over her, followed immediately by exhaustion. Flynn's arm around her was the only thing keeping her upright. "You drove through an ambush," he said, his voice a mix of admiration and horror. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" "We didn't have much choice," she replied shakily. Flynn's other hand came up to cup her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I thought when I heard the shots," he couldn't seem to finish the sentence. And then, with the suddenness of a summer storm, he was kissing her. His lips were warm and desperate against hers, his arms pulling her against him as if he could shield her from all danger through sheer proximity. Delilah responded instinctively, her own arms winding around his neck, the terror of the past hour transforming into a different kind of intensity. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I shouldn't have." "Don't apologize," she interrupted. "Not for that. Not ever for that." His eyes searched hers, finding no regret, only a reflection of his own feelings. "Delilah," he began, but was interrupted by shouts from the men returning from the pass. "They're gone," Darby reported. "Lit out when they saw us coming back. Left 2 horses behind." Flynn reluctantly released Delilah, though he kept a hand at the small of her back. "Any idea who they were?" Darby nodded grimly. "Same bunch as before, I'd wager. Found this on one of the horses." He held out a distinctive silver spur. "Matches one we found after the night raid." Flynn's expression darkened. "They're following us, waiting for opportunities." "Why?" Delilah asked. "Surely a few cattle aren't worth such persistence." "It's not about the cattle," Flynn explained. "It's about the money we'll be carrying on the return journey." The implications sank in. Even after successfully delivering the herd and collecting payment, they would face the dangerous return to Broken Spur, a smaller group, carrying a substantial sum, traveling through the same territory where they'd already been attacked twice. "We need to reach Trinidad quickly," Flynn decided, "and figure out a safer way back." That night, after Cookie had been patched up and was resting comfortably, Flynn sought out Delilah. She was sitting by the fire, writing in her journal, her face illuminated by the flickering light. "May I join you?" he asked formally. She closed the journal and nodded, suddenly shy in his presence. The memory of their kiss hung between them, both exhilarating and unsettling. Flynn sat beside her, closer than propriety might dictate but not quite touching. "I've been thinking about what happens when we reach Trinidad," he said, echoing their interrupted conversation from days earlier. "And?" she prompted when he paused. "And I don't want things to go back to how they were before." His voice was low, meant only for her ears. "I don't want you to go back to being Miss Morgan the schoolteacher, and me to be Mr. Callahan the rancher." Delilah's heart quickened. "What do you want, Flynn?" He turned to face her fully. "I want what I should have wanted from the moment you arrived at Broken Spur. I want to court you properly, Delilah Morgan, to see if what I feel, what I hope you feel, could grow into something lasting." The directness of his declaration took her breath away. "I think you know it already has," she replied softly. Flynn's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. "I've never been good with words," he admitted. "Better with cattle than people. But these weeks on the trail, seeing your courage, your determination, I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore." "Then don't," she said simply. His smile transformed his face, erasing the lines of worry and fatigue. "When we return to Broken Spur, things will be different," he promised. "Better." "I'd like that," Delilah agreed, leaning slightly against his shoulder. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge overhead. The dangers ahead remained, but something fundamental had shifted between them, creating a foundation of shared purpose and feeling that made those challenges seem less daunting. The remaining journey to Trinidad was arduous but uneventful. They pushed hard, stopping only when absolutely necessary, Flynn unwilling to risk another confrontation with the persistent rustlers. Cookie recovered enough to resume his duties, though Delilah insisted on handling the heavier tasks. As they approached their destination, the landscape changed, becoming more populated. They began to encounter other travelers, freight wagons, and eventually the signs of a growing railroad town, smoke from distant chimneys, the straight lines of telegraph poles, the faint but unmistakable sound of a train whistle. They arrived in Trinidad on December 10th, 5 days ahead of the deadline. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad stockyards were impressive, well-built pens, loading chutes, and a small office where J.W. Henderson, the purchasing agent, greeted them with surprise and approval. "Didn't expect you quite so soon, Mr. Callahan," he said, pumping Flynn's hand. "Cattle look to be in fine condition, considering the journey." The next 2 days were consumed with business counting and inspecting the cattle, negotiating final terms, completing paperwork. Delilah's bookkeeping skills proved invaluable, impressing Henderson enough that he offered her a position with the railroad, which she politely declined. When the transaction was finally complete, Flynn received a bank draft for an amount that exceeded even their most optimistic projections. The relief on his face as he tucked the paper safely into his inside pocket was palpable. "The loan is covered," he told Delilah privately, "with enough left over to see Broken Spur through the winter and make some improvements in the spring." "I'm so glad," she said sincerely. "You've worked so hard for this." "We've worked for it," he corrected. "Couldn't have done it without you." With their business concluded, they faced the question of the return journey. Flynn gathered the men to discuss options. "We could take the train part of the way," Darby suggested. "At least as far as Santa Fe." Flynn nodded. "Been considering that. Safer and faster, though more expensive. Worth every penny if it means not getting shot at again," Cookie grumbled, his arm still in a sling. The decision was made to split the group. Flynn, Delilah, and 4 men would take the train to Santa Fe, carrying the bank draft. The remaining drovers would return with the horses and wagon via the trail, meeting them in Santa Fe for the final leg home. Before departing Trinidad, Flynn insisted on one more piece of business. He took Delilah to the town's main street, stopping outside a small dress shop. "What are we doing here?" she asked, puzzled. "You've been wearing the same 2 dresses for weeks," he pointed out. "Thought you might like something new for the journey home." Delilah was touched by his thoughtfulness but hesitated. "Flynn, the money is for Broken Spur," he finished. "And you're part of Broken Spur now." His voice softened. "Please, let me do this for you." Inside, the shopkeeper, a Frenchwoman named Madame Fouquet, clucked disapprovingly at Delilah's trail-worn appearance, but quickly warmed to the romantic notion of a cattle drive romance. She produced several ready-made dresses, finally settling on a deep blue traveling suit that complemented Delilah's auburn hair and fair complexion. "You look beautiful," Flynn said when she emerged from the fitting room. Delilah smoothed the unfamiliar fabric, feeling both elegant and self-conscious. "It's lovely, but hardly practical for ranch life." "Every woman needs at least one impractical dress," he replied with a smile. "For special occasions." The train journey to Santa Fe was a novel experience for Delilah, who had traveled east to west by stagecoach. The relative comfort and speed were remarkable, though Flynn remained vigilant, insisting that at least one of them stay awake at all times to guard their valuable bank draft. They arrived in Santa Fe on December 18th and checked into a modest hotel to await the rest of their party. The city was decorated for Christmas, with paper lanterns and pine boughs adorning the plaza. The festive atmosphere was infectious, and Flynn suggested they explore while waiting for the others. As they walked through the market, admiring local crafts and sampling regional foods, Delilah was acutely aware of how natural it felt to be at Flynn's side. He walked closer than propriety strictly allowed, occasionally placing his hand at the small of her back to guide her through crowds. Several times, she caught him looking at her with an expression that made her heart race. That evening, Flynn arranged for them to dine at the hotel's restaurant, the first proper meal they'd had in weeks. Delilah wore her new blue dress, and Flynn had purchased a clean shirt and had his beard trimmed for the occasion. "You look different," she observed as they were seated. "More like the Flynn Callahan who first met me at Broken Spur. And you look nothing like the woman washing her hair in a trough," he countered with a smile. "Though I thought you were beautiful even then." Delilah blushed. "You never said anything." "Wouldn't have been proper," he replied. "You were my responsibility, your uncle's niece, and I wasn't sure you'd stay." "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. "Everything was so foreign, the land, the work, the people. And now, she met his eyes steadily. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. Flynn reached across the table to take her hand. I've been thinking about what happens when we return to Broken Spur. You mentioned things would be different, she recalled. He nodded. I'd like to court you properly, Delilah. No more hiding behind propriety or duty. I want everyone to know my intentions. And what are your intentions, Mr. Callahan? She asked, her tone light though her heart was pounding. Flynn's expression grew serious. To make you happy. To build a life with you if you'll have me. The simplicity and sincerity of his declaration moved her deeply. I would like that very much, she whispered. Their remaining time in Santa Fe passed in a pleasant haze of shared meals, walks through the historic city, and increasingly open affection. When the rest of their party finally arrived on December 22nd, weary but safe, plans were made to depart for Broken Spur the following morning. We should reach home by Christmas Eve if we push hard, Flynn announced. I know you're all eager to return to your families. The journey back was challenging but uneventful. They traveled in a tight group, weapons ready but unused. The rustlers, if they were still in the area, made no attempt to confront such a well-prepared party. As they approached Broken Spur late on December 24th, a sense of accomplishment and homecoming swept through the group. Lights burned in the main house windows, and figures emerged as they rode into the yard, those who had remained behind rushing out to greet the returning heroes. Flynn helped Delilah down from her horse, keeping her hand in his longer than necessary. Welcome home, he said softly. The next hours were a blur of activity, unpacking, sharing tales of the journey, enjoying the Christmas Eve supper that had been prepared in anticipation of their return. Flynn discreetly handled the bank draft, securing it in the ranch safe until the bank reopened after the holiday. Later, as the celebration continued in the main house, Flynn found Delilah standing alone on the porch, gazing up at the star-filled sky. Everything all right? He asked, joining her. She nodded. Just thinking about how much has changed since I last stood here. It feels like years ago, not weeks. Flynn moved closer, his arm brushing against hers. Good changes, I hope. The best, she assured him, turning to face him. Though I find I miss one thing about the trail. What's that? The privacy, she admitted. Everyone's watching us now, waiting to see what happens between us. Flynn glanced back at the house, where curious faces periodically appeared at the window. They'll have to keep wondering until tomorrow, he said mysteriously. I have something to show you. Intrigued, Delilah allowed him to lead her away from the house, across the yard to her quarters, the converted storage shed that had been her first real home at Broken Spur. As they approached, she noticed something different, light glowing from within, though she knew she'd left no lamp burning. Flynn opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Delilah gasped in surprise. The small room had been transformed in her absence. Fresh curtains hung at the window, a colorful quilt adorned the bed, and a small Christmas tree stood in one corner, decorated with paper stars and ribbon. But the most stunning change was in the bathing area. The copper tub had been replaced with a larger one, and beside it stood a beautiful folding screen made of wood and fabric that would provide complete privacy. A small stove had been installed nearby, with pipes arranged to heat water. Flynn, she breathed, taking it all in. How did you? I sent instructions ahead when we telegraphed our arrival time, he explained. The men who stayed behind did the work. Do you like it? It's perfect, she said, running her hand along the edge of the new tub. But why? Flynn moved to stand before her, taking both her hands in his. Do you remember what I said when I first found you washing your hair in the trough? You said I deserved a tub and a door that locks, she recalled with a smile. And now you have them, he said softly. But there's something else you deserve, Delilah Morgan. To her astonishment, Flynn lowered himself to one knee, still holding her hands in his. You deserve someone who will cherish you for the remarkable woman you are, who will build a life with you based on respect and love. His voice grew husky with emotion. If you'll have me, I want to be that man. Tears blurred Delilah's vision as the meaning of his words sank in. Are you asking what I think you're asking? Flynn reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a simple gold band set with a single pearl. This was my mother's, he explained. I've carried it with me since she passed, waiting for the right woman to give it to. He took a deep breath. Delilah Morgan, will you marry me? Yes, she answered without hesitation. Yes, Flynn Callahan, I will marry you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to gather her in his arms, Delilah felt the journey that had begun with her washing her hair in a trough had led her exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of a man who had seen her worth from the beginning, even when she couldn't see it herself. Their kiss was a promise of the life they would build together at Broken Spur, a life of challenges and triumphs, hard work and simple joys, and above all, a love that had been forged in the wild, untamed beauty of the West. Flynn and Delilah were married on New Year's Day, 1878, in the small church in Dry Creek. The entire population of the settlement turned out for the occasion. Along with every hand from Broken Spur, Delilah wore her blue traveling dress with a crown of winter berries in her hair, and Flynn cut a handsome figure in a new black suit purchased specially for the occasion. The school board reluctantly accepted Delilah's resignation, though she promised to help find and train her replacement. I'll still be involved with the school, she assured them, but my place is at Broken Spur now. Flynn used part of the cattle drive profits to begin improvements on the ranch house, adding a proper bathroom with a pump that brought water directly inside, the first such modern convenience in the county. He also expanded the main house, creating a private wing for them with large windows that looked out over the mountains. Spring brought new calves, green grass, and the news that Delilah was expecting their first child. The baby, a boy they named Henry after her uncle, was born in November, strong and healthy, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's copper hair. Over the years, Broken Spur prospered under their joint stewardship. Flynn's knowledge of cattle and land combined with Delilah's head for business proved an unbeatable combination. They added 2 more children to their family, a daughter, Margaret, named after Delilah's aunt, and another son, William, who arrived as a surprise blessing when they thought their family complete. Delilah never forgot her first days at the ranch, particularly the moment when a stern-faced cowboy found her washing her hair in a trough and declared she deserved better. On their 10th anniversary, Flynn presented her with a photograph of the family standing proudly in front of the ranch house, which now boasted not just indoor plumbing but also glass windows and a wrap-around porch. From a trough to all this, he mused, his arm around her waist. Quite a journey. The best journey, she replied, leaning into his embrace. And it's only just beginning. And as they stood together, watching their children play in the yard where once she'd been a lonely, uncertain young woman with nowhere else to go, Delilah knew that Flynn had given her far more than a tub and a door that locks. He had given her a home, a family, and a love that would endure through all the seasons of their lives on the frontier they both cherished.